They're all upstairs.
Yeah,
I told Brendan, go upstairs and get them down.
yeah, that's right. I mean, you're the chairman, but I think we should get one. It's 5 after. And of course,
Okay,
Jim,
the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change will now come to order. Today, we are proceeding in a slightly different order. Chairman Pallone and I will each speak for no more than 4 minutes so that we can yield the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. McEachin, 2 minutes after Chairman Pallone has spoken. I recognize myself for 4 minutes for the purpose of an opening statement. Yesterday, I joined Chairman Pallone, Energy Subcommittee Chairman Rush, and other members of the committee to announce support for a 100% clean economy by no later than 2050. Congress is looking to this committee to take a leading role in developing the policies to achieve a net zero greenhouse gas emissions result. This must include significant direct emissions reductions in every community and a just and equitable transition for every American, including adversely impacted individuals and communities. This is the first in a series of hearings to study the challenges and potential solutions before us. One thing is clear. We cannot afford to wait until 2050 or even 2030 to act. We must be prepared for the earliest opportunity with a plan that can garner support from a very broad coalition. After 10 years of congressional inaction, today no consensus exists on the best policies to achieve this scientifically necessary target. But we have the benefit of a panel of expert witnesses who can discuss effective pathways for decarbonization. I believe there is a broad agreement that our decarbonization strategy should seek to improve energy efficiency, deploy new and preserve existing clean electricity resources, enable electrification across all sectors of our economy, and utilize carbon dioxide removal through natural and technological methods. This core strategy will not capture all greenhouse gas emissions. We will also need development of cleaner fuels for heavy-duty transportation and new materials and processes for industrial applications. We also acknowledge that any meaningful climate action will require significant federal investments, particularly in rural, deindustrialized, and environmental justice communities, which will create new economic opportunities and accelerate the transition to a clean energy future for all. Despite apparent agreement on this overall strategy of decarbonization, there is little consensus on which specific policy mechanisms would be most effective and fair to achieve it. No single policy will deliver America's transition to a 100% clean economy on its own. Congress must develop economy-wide and sector-specific solutions, and we should be clear. This target requires nothing short of transforming the United States economy. If we can limit economic disruptions and expand opportunities in the process, we should do so. Throughout this process, we will consider how deep decarbonization may impact communities and workers, equity and environmental justice, energy affordability and United States competitiveness, and processes that are difficult to decarbonize. But we must also keep this simple fact in mind. Comprehensive climate action will create millions of good-paying jobs, building a clean energy and climate-resilient economy while reducing harmful pollution. Efforts to rebuild and modernize our infrastructure, research and deploy clean technologies, promote workforce development, and ensure safe and healthy communities will strengthen American global competitiveness and economic leadership throughout the 21st century. The work we do here will impact millions of Americans and generations to come. We have committed to ensuring this process will be open to all ideas and thoughtful in its response. We have already engaged with numerous stakeholders and committed to them that they have a seat at this table. A collaborative, open approach is the only way to ensure America's climate transition is not only possible, but also just and equitable. I look forward to today's discussion, as well as a rigorous, open, and honest exploration of the potential solutions in the months ahead to put America on the pathway to a clean economy. With that, I now recognize Mr. Shimkus, our ranking member of the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing kicks off the subcommittee's review of policies that would aim to substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the United States economy. The goals of what is called deep decarbonization are bold and would sweep across every aspect of our society. The most aggressive of them call for regulatory schemes to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 and would change how we generate electricity, fuel our vehicles, grow our food, and make the steel and cement and other ingredients of modern infrastructure, cities, and industry. As we examine decarbonization policies, I hope we can keep appropriate perspective. For example, we should be clear that some of these goals are not possible to achieve with current technology or through renewable energy alone. Some are too expensive to implement in any way that would preserve affordable energy and the goods and services we rely upon in our daily lives. We have to take a hard look at the full cost of domestic policies that would transform our electric infrastructure, our energy systems, our mobility. Hearings like this can help start to shine the light on all of these. We also should recognize that we are talking about a global issue. As noted in the previous hearings, there has been unrelenting growth in global carbon emissions, even as the U.S. emissions have declined. While projections show global emissions growth may level off, they will not decline very much as nations continue to seek the tremendous benefits of energy, power, and transportation in their societies as they continue to acquire the steel, cement, and other infrastructure needed for building and expanding. This is particularly true for China, India, and rest of the developing world. Affordable energy and industrial output are key ingredients for these growing economies. The plain fact is the world, according to projections by the International Energy Agency, will continue to rely primarily on fossil forms of energy for the foreseeable future. And the developing world will continue to dominate global emissions in the years to come. The policies we consider in the United States should be considered against this global energy and economic reality. We should not put the United States at a competitive disadvantage to other nations or deprive our nation important opportunities to innovate and develop the new fossil or nuclear technologies or industrial technologies that promise cleaner future energy systems. Focusing on global energy and economic realities will help us focus on where the real gains can be achieved in reducing future emissions and maintaining the prosperity necessary for addressing future climate risk. Let me suggest that these gains will come less from radically and expensively transforming a mature $20 trillion U.S. economy than providing the modern, clean, and low-emission technologies to nations still putting their modern economies into place. In recent months, we have been building a record that underscores the critical need for technological breakthroughs to develop cleaner energy and economic systems. This morning, we will hear from witnesses who can speak to what is necessary to move these technological breakthroughs forward, and we welcome you. I am particularly looking forward to hearing from Shannon Angelski of the Carbon Utilization Council. She will speak to the contribution of fossil fuel technologies to decarbonization objectives, and she can outline how bipartisan work in Congress has helped create new markets and what more is needed to ensure that these policies are effective. The bottom line is, there are practical policies we can pursue in a bipartisan fashion that will help incentivize the development of innovative technologies for coal and natural gas, as well as nuclear energy that will strengthen American leadership in these critical sectors. We should avoid complex regulatory and command and control schemes that the majority sometimes seeks to impose. These would foreclose the potential for innovations that will enable full use of our nation's tremendous energy and economic resources. Our goal should be to perfect the bipartisan policies that will allow innovation in the private sector to provide the new technologies that will provide the path to lower emissions, especially where this is needed most. And with that, Mr. Chairman, that ends my opening statement. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, chairman of the full committee, for 4 minutes for his opening statement. Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. One of this committee's top priorities is combating climate change. Yesterday, I joined Chairman Tonko and Rush and other committee Democrats in announcing a bold plan to address the climate crisis by achieving a 100% clean economy by 2050. Our plan is based on the science. International scientific experts tell us we must invest in clean technologies and initiate an aggressive economy-wide effort now to achieve this goal. So yesterday, we outlined a process for reaching the goal, and that process begins today with this hearing where we will examine the challenges and opportunities that exist for reducing greenhouse gas pollution from the major sectors of our economy. Recent reports by U.S. scientists and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change paint a grim picture if we do not get carbon pollution under control. We're already experiencing record flooding, sea level rise, intense wildfires, extended drought, and severe weather events that experts projected would come with increased warming. And I don't have to tell anybody that. Anybody knows over the weekend, the temperature in my district got to 103. We lost power for about 30 to 40% of the homes in my home county, including my own home. And my wife called me this morning to say that power finally came on at 2:30 a.m. You know, this is what we're all facing. These events are taking a terrible toll on our communities, and we must act. Transforming our economy is no easy task. There will be costs associated with the transformation of this scope, but the costs of inaction are extremely high and rising. Fortunately, the calls for action continue to grow this week. 28 global companies representing a combined market capitalization of $1.2 trillion responded to the UN call to action by committing to the goal of net zero emissions by 2050. And we'll hear from our witnesses, this transformation is challenging but not impossible. We have many technologies available today that with wider deployment can lower carbon and other harmful pollutants in the near term. Some sectors will present greater challenges and will require new technologies and significant investment to reach net zero, but we want to reward innovation and the businesses that invest in clean technologies. However, we cannot only focus on business and technologies and hope that individual workers and communities automatically benefit by their adoption. We know that doesn't always happen, and that economic transformations can leave people and communities behind. Workers displaced from lucrative jobs in fossil fuel-dependent industries must be able to find equally profitable jobs in their communities and in new clean industries. And we must reinvest in communities that currently are more exposed to harmful pollution and climate change. We can use this opportunity to ensure that the economy works for everyone and supports a safe, healthy environment. The U.S. is a leader in innovation, but we cannot stay competitive with outdated technology and infrastructure. We must get ahead in the race to a clean economy. We need to grow now. Clean industries here and employ our workers to deliver modern, high-quality products to the world. And we have the talent and resources. All we need now is determination to act. So as we begin this process, and we think of ourselves, and we are the Innovation Committee, I invite everyone to share their ideas with us about how to modernize our infrastructure and transform our economy to reduce carbon pollution, create family-sustaining jobs, and lead the world in growing new clean industries. And I look forward to working with all of you as our effort to develop legislation to achieve 100 by 50 moves forward. And again, I particularly want to thank our two subcommittee chairs, Mr. Tonko and Mr. Rush. Basically, the 100 by 50 was Mr. Tonko's idea, and he's been working for some time, not only the last 6 months since we've been in the majority, but for many years on this goal and best ways to achieve it. And so we'll see how we develop that over the next few months when we return from the August recess. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and thank you for your kind words, Chairman. And the Chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Thanks for having this hearing. As you all pointed out yesterday, the Democrats held a press conference to outline their plans for decarbonizing the United States by 2050, and today we're reviewing some potential paths to achieve that goal, and that's important. We need to fully understand what decarbonization means for consumers and for American workers. Republicans support innovation, conservation, adaptation, and preparation. We support prudent steps to reduce emissions and to address current and future climate risks. These steps require we examine the costs, the effectiveness, and the economic impacts of various solutions proposed to address the risks. They require we do not undermine the economic priorities of communities and states around the nation. For this reason, we've urged our majority colleagues to avoid resurrecting top-down policies that are costly and harmful. Taxation and regulation can lead to economic stagnation and hurts consumers and workers. But instead, we'd like them to work with us on bipartisan solutions like those that we have pursued over the last several Congresses with great success. Those policies have continued America's leadership in developing innovative technologies to produce energy with little or no emissions. And our record on this front is clear and positive for the climate. Republicans have been working with Democrats over the past several Congresses to remove regulatory barriers to new technological advances in power generation, from hydroelectric power to small modular nuclear, from carbon capture and storage incentives to power grid reforms. Because innovation is where the long-term solutions to climate change are, we want America to lead. We want America to lead the world in innovation, as we always have, especially on clean energy and environmental cleanup as well. Instead of focusing solely on regulations and taxations that mandate emissions reductions in the U.S., we need to put more emphasis on the parts of the world with some of the greatest CO2 emissions, like China and India. Our most effective policies are the ones that encourage and support development of clean energy here at home and abroad by American workers and by innovators. We can develop these new technologies and we can market them to the world. We support realistic solutions that will have meaningful impact on global emissions while growing the U.S. economy and protecting American workers. That's why we pursued policies like the 45Q carbon sequester tax credit that Republicans enacted last Congress. They offer much in the potential for cleaner fossil fuels and sequester of carbon. We will hear this morning about the promises carbon capture holds and what might be done to improve its prospects, and we're excited to learn about that. And we know there's more innovation just over the horizon in these areas. We should talk about what it takes to ensure the United States can lead on clean fossil energy technology and on nuclear technology and not cede our dominance to our adversarial competitors globally. We already risk that in nuclear technology space, and we need to make sure that doesn't continue. Now, closer to home, we have to pursue practical policies that strengthen local economies and make our communities safe. In my part of the world in the Northwest, we've benefited from clean hydropower, from wind generation and geothermal and solar power. We've suffered greatly, though, from the lack of management of our federal forest lands, which are burning up every summer, choking our citizens and polluting our atmosphere. Actively managing our forests not only reduces the risks of fire, it also reduces carbon emissions, as proven out by the IPCC itself. It promotes healthy, younger stands of trees, maximizes our forest's ability to actively sequester carbon. All this while creating jobs and wood products that store carbon. Unfortunately, we've got about 80 million acres in need of treatment and needed now. Our federal forests lag behind. We need to pass legislation like the Resilient Federal Forest Acts, which I've introduced with others, to address this. And whether that's considered decarbonization or not, it is the right kind of bipartisan policy to pursue, and we can do it right here in America. So let's talk about that as well, and let's talk about the needs for our communities from the fossil energy-rich cities and counties in Texas and Pennsylvania that have been pursuing the economic benefits fostered by the technological revolution in oil and natural gas production, to the New England communities that do not have the energy infrastructure to assure even heat and power on the coldest or hottest nights or warmest days. So let's talk about these policies, too, in terms of what matters to people every day. And then together, we should be able to find bipartisan solutions moving forward as we have in the past. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. With that, I now introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. We have Dr. Carl Hausker, Senior Fellow, Climate Program at the World Resources Institute. Next, we have Ms. Shannon Angelski, Executive Director of the Carbon Utilization Research Council. Then Mr. Armand Cohen, Executive Director of the Clean Air Task Force. And finally, Dr. Cletus, who is the Policy Director of Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Before we begin, I would like to explain the lighting system. In front of you are a series of lights. The light will initially be green at the start of your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining. Please begin to wrap up your testimony at that point. The light will turn red when your time has expired. At this time, the chair will now recognize Dr. Hausker for 5 minutes to provide his opening statement. And welcome to you and all of our panelists, and thank you for your time and the intellect that you'll share with us.
Members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on America's clean energy future. And Chairman Tonko, Chairman Pallone, and colleagues, I really thank you for your leadership on launching a plan for developing climate legislation. Let me focus on the 4 main takeaway messages in my testimony, and I'll refer to figures in that testimony as I go. First, what does science tell us about emission pathways that can limit warming to 1.5 degrees? In Figure 1, you'll see that global emissions need to reach net zero by mid-century and then actually turn negative. We need to achieve negative emissions later in the century. Why negative? because we are likely to overshoot safe concentrations of greenhouse gases that would keep us at 1.5 degrees. So we need sharp declines in emissions beginning in the 2020s, and we will need, as you noted, major transformations in electricity generation, buildings, transport, and industry. And then we will have to move to creating negative emissions through carbon dioxide removal. We can do that through natural means, planting trees and improving soil health, and we can also do it through technical means. And the two leading candidates are bioenergy plants with carbon capture and sequestration, or the direct capture of CO2 from air, its concentration and safe storage underground. We will likely need carbon dioxide removal at a large scale, up to 10 billion tons of CO2 per year by around mid-century. And this amount will exceed the capacity of those natural means and perhaps exceed what we can do with bioenergy with CCS. And that's why I really want to emphasize that we are likely to need CCS with direct air capture by mid-century at the scale of billions of tons per year. And this leads me directly to my second major takeaway. We must further develop CCS technology. Regardless of whether you think we need it on power plants, we will need it for that job of carbon dioxide removal. Similarly, CCS will be needed for various industrial sources that have process emissions, iron, steel, chemicals, and cement. So we must take key steps in the coming decade, improve the technology, scale up CCS, bring costs down, build pipelines and injection sites, refine our policy and governance frameworks, and build public acceptance. We can't wait till 2030 or 2040 to decide what to do on CCS. My third takeaway, the transformations needed to get to net zero emissions are technologically feasible and affordable. We can do it with current technology and near commercial technology in the pipeline. But we should also innovate, as several of you have said, to keep being able to do it better and do it cheaper. The strategies for transformation are depicted in Figure 2 in my testimony. It's quite simple at one level. First, be as energy efficient as possible across all sectors of the economy. Second, electrification. Switch everywhere possible from the direct combustion of fossil fuels to the direct use of electricity. Where you can't do that, develop the low carbon, zero carbon fuels for those end uses. Third, we're going to build a lot of electricity with zero carbon. That electrification process will make this a huge growth industry. So we will electrify the economy, and then we need to go to zero carbon generation. And fourth, the fourth key strategy, of course, is carbon capture, which I just described. Takeaway number 4, my last takeaway. To produce all that carbon-free electricity, we can build out solar and wind very aggressively in the coming years, but we also need to fully commercialize the other zero carbon options. So in Figure 3 in my testimony, I depict the great, wonderful, jaw-dropping decrease in solar and wind costs over the last 10 years. Many models suggest that we could move to 60, 70, 80, maybe even 90% renewable generation from solar and wind over the next decades, especially if we support it with transmission and expanded transmission, demand management, and storage. However, most modelers and analysts understand that we need to complement any wind and solar with other dispatchable and firm power sources. Sometimes you can do that with hydro and geothermal and bioenergy, but we are also likely to need carbon-free generation sources that aren't constrained by location, like hydro and geothermal. So the good news here is that companies like Net Power are developing CCS approaches to capture 100% of emissions from fossil fuel plants. And companies like NuScale are developing advanced nuclear options and small modular reactors that can play a role in America's clean energy future. So my closing thought is it's risky to bet the climate on just a single set of technologies. Support RD&D across a broad set, and let's keep our focus on carbon emissions, not on the market share of any particular technology. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hausker. And next, we'll hear from Ms. Angelski. You are recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko and Ranking Member Shimkus, for the invitation to testify before the subcommittee today and to discuss initiatives that can decarbonize the U.S. economy. And we really appreciate your leadership on these issues. I just want to start by introducing the Carbon Utilization Research Council. CURC is an industry coalition focused on technology solutions for the responsible use of our fossil energy resources in a balanced, low-carbon generation portfolio. Members of CURC believe that American fossil fuels and ingenuity and technology innovation will satisfy the world's growing appetite for affordable energy, improve energy security, increase exports of U.S. resources and manufactured energy equipment, create high-paying jobs, and improve environmental quality. In order to achieve these objectives, members of CURC are at the forefront of their industries to develop and commercialize technologies that will transform the way the world uses fossil fuels. My testimony will address 5 key points, describing what is needed to unlock the innovation that is needed to decarbonize the use of fossil fuels in the power sector. Point 1, the growing use of fossil fuels must be accompanied by robust investment in carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS. This is because global fossil fuel use is projected to rise well into the future. As a result, modeling conducted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Energy Agency, or the IEA, agree that carbon capture is an integral part of the technology solution set in order to cost-effectively achieve global climate targets. A recent IEA analysis shows that at high capture rates, or when combined with sustainable biofuels, power generated from fossil fuels can achieve net zero carbon emissions. Other recent analysis from IEA estimates that by 2060, CCUS accounts for approximately 100 gigatons of the CO2 emissions reductions needed to meet the global goals of the 2-degree scenario. To put this scale of emissions reductions into perspective, this would be the same as roughly 1,100 coal units installing carbon capture by 2030 and storing CO2 from those systems for the next 30 years. This would also be the same as 3,200 natural gas combined cycle units with the same amount of carbon capture over the same period. Modeling also shows that in order to achieve deep decarbonization goals, CCUS must be complemented with technologies such as direct air capture and other negative emissions technologies. To date, however, carbon capture has not been deployed at the rate needed to achieve deep decarbonization objectives. Point 2, U.S. industry thankfully has years of experience with CCUS. Projects operating in the U.S. today capture roughly 25 million metric tons of CO2 annually from industrial processes. Large volumes of CO2 are also transported through a 4,500-mile pipeline network, and some of that CO2 is stored in well-documented and studied geologic reservoirs across the country. For more CCUS deployment to occur, projects need to integrate each of these individual elements together into one system. The Petronova project that retrofit a coal power plant with carbon capture in Texas and transports that CO2 via a pipeline into a nearby oil field, as well as the Archer Daniels Midland ethanol production facility with carbon capture in Illinois, are just 2 prime examples of how to integrate those different industries together into one process and demonstrate that CCUS is technically feasible. Point 3, while carbon capture is in the early stages of deployment, the U.S. is making significant strides to reduce costs and create a robust carbon capture industry. Innovative research and development is well underway that will further improve the cost and performance of new carbon capture technologies through DOE's world-class carbon capture and storage programs. These technologies have the promise of providing dispatchable fossil fuel power generation with low to zero carbon emissions necessary to support the growth of renewables and achieve deep decarbonization of the power grid. Importantly, carbon capture is fuel and emissions agnostic. This means investment in power sector applications will also benefit the use of carbon capture in other industries and when applied to other fuel gas streams. With improved technology and deployment, the technology will follow a well-understood cost reduction curve, and economies of scale will be achieved in the same way this happened with the wind and solar industries. 4, investments in carbon capture will benefit the environment, improve energy security, and provide macroeconomic benefits to the U.S. economy. Analysis conducted by Kirk and ClearPath Foundation shows that there are significant economic benefits to the U.S. if the public-private sector investments in carbon capture are undertaken. Our analysis projects that at least 17 gigawatts and up to 87 gigawatts of market-driven carbon capture paired with enhanced oil recovery will significantly increase oil production, lower retail electricity rates, and all of which contribute to substantial increases in annual GDP, as well as create over 800,000 new jobs by 2040. 5, with robust and sustained policy support, carbon capture can contribute to any deep decarbonization goals. 45Q is a key policy tool for catalyzing a carbon capture industry in this country and is seen as a model policy by international energy entities. And while several carbon capture projects are in development as a result of this policy, project developers are eagerly awaiting issuance of Treasury guidance to understand how to use the tax credits. However, even as the U.S. continues to invest in innovative research and projects that will be incentivized through the use of these credits, it's important to recognize that multiple policy tools will be needed to accelerate and attract investment in carbon capture. That's, I just want to mention there are several CCUS bills in Congress pending that would do that, some of which are before this committee, and I just want to recognize Congressman Peters and Mr. McKinley on the Utilizing Significant Emissions Act, as well as the Carbon Capture Modernization Act, are just two examples. So in closing, I just want to close by saying the world is watching as we embark on these initiatives. Investment in CCUS will transform carbon dioxide into an economic resource, lower the cost of reducing emissions, save consumers money, and safeguard the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Angelski. And Mr. Cohen, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member Shimkus, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify this morning. Rather than read a written statement, I presented or prepared several slides, visuals that I think I want to just walk you through to kind of connect some of the threads you've already heard. It's labeled supporting slides. So if you turn with me to the first page, there's a pie chart, and it's U.S. energy CO2 emissions by sector. And so we talk a lot about electricity, but as some of the previous speakers have mentioned, it's not just about electricity. Actually, electricity is 40% of the CO2 energy problem in the United States. Agriculture is, I'll put in a separate category. The point is there are many sectors to address here. We've got a $2 trillion a year energy economy that we have to decarbonize over a period of decades. My bottom line is that it's tough but feasible if we retain options to go down multiple pathways at once. And those pathways are represented in the next slide, which is called Puzzle Pieces for a 100% carbon-free energy economy. And there you can see that we have to do a number of things simultaneously, some of which have been mentioned. We can utilize variable zero-carbon electricity that we have today at low cost, like wind, solar, and with storage. We'll need firm, always available zero-carbon electricity to balance the grid. I'll get to that in a minute. We'll need carbon capture and storage. We'll need electrification. We'll need low-carbon industrial processes. And at the center of this puzzle diagram, you'll see something called zero-carbon fuels, which are essential to making all of this work. If we have a zero-carbon drop-in liquid or gaseous fuel to substitute for current gas and oil, we have really a winning combination. Finally, there's a puzzle piece called superpollutants, which is really dealing with methane leakage from the fossil fuel system, which we'll have to do if fossil energy is to be part of this decarbonized future. The next slide is a somewhat complicated diagram, but I won't walk through in detail, but it's called a zero-carbon energy system. The point that's made here is that we need to succeed, we're going to need a complementary set of technologies. You'll see that zero-carbon electricity is kind of at the core, because you can do a lot, as Dr. Hausker has recommended, in terms of building, decarbonization, industry, and transport, but we're going to need some other things. And to the left of the zero-carbon electricity diagram, you'll see hydrogen, and we would add to that hydrogen-derived fuels like ammonia, which can be used as substitutes for gas and oil. The way that we create zero-carbon electricity through renewables, through nuclear energy, and through fossil energy with carbon capture. Interestingly, there are a lot of crossovers in here and complementarities among these technologies. So, for example, you'll see towards the bottom of the page that kind of all roads lead to carbon capture, as has been mentioned. Carbon capture really does triple duty. It can decarbonize electricity, it can help create zero-carbon fuels for transport, and it can help create zero-carbon fuels for industrial heat and process. So very, very critical linchpin technology, electrolysis and hydrogen transformation as well. And you'll see that nuclear also plays a role in this picture along with renewables. An overarching point is there's been a lot of talk about Apollo 11 in the last week, rightly so, but my view is this is not about moonshots. This is about test flights. And it's about some smart earthbound engineering. Most of what's in these diagrams has already been demonstrated. Not all of it has been demonstrated or built multiple series at commercial scale, but it has all fundamentally been demonstrated, whether it's nuclear or carbon capture. It's about smart engineering, it's about getting into mass production and bringing costs down. Let me close by addressing the electric part of this equation, which, as we've mentioned, is absolutely critical. We have a great head start on electricity. A third of the United States power grid is already decarbonized. Between hydroelectric, wind and solar, and nuclear, we're now a third of the way there. So we need to get the other two-thirds of the way there. So how do we do that? As was mentioned, we have an enormous accomplishment to be proud of, which is the degree to which wind and solar costs have come down. I have no doubt that they will be the backbone of a future decarbonized electric grid, but that may not be the whole solution. They might be, but I believe that there's reason from the modeling and the analysis that's been done, which I'm going to walk you through in the next minute, that we can talk about at greater length in the Q&A. To demonstrate why we need things in addition to variable weather-dependent electricity, if you turn to slide 4, you'll see I took the example of California because it's a state that's blessed with renewable resources, it's also a state that's very dedicated to decarbonizing its grid and has actually put that into law. You can see that wind and sun vary by season. If it were just a question of daily wind and sun variability, we could do that with battery storage pretty cheaply. But the fact is we have seasonal variations, and as you can see, a factor of 400% or 500% variation for months over the year. If you, at the bottom of slide 4, you'll see the demand in California, which is pretty constant throughout the year, but you'll see that the available resource, wind and solar resource combined, fluctuates quite a bit over the year, over seasonal patterns. And if you flip the page to slide 5, you'll see that the result is that we have what essentially is a seasonal surplus and a seasonal deficit. That's very expensive to deal with battery storage, even if we drop the price of batteries by, say, 80%. My final slide just shows that if we go to a system that's, let's say, half renewables, we probably have modest cost right now, and we can manage that with storage. If we push a lot farther than that right now without firm energy in the system, which would be the light blue bars, we're looking at a very steep incline. So bottom line is firm energy, zero carbon energy, very important, and we can address that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Mr. Cohen, thank you. And now, Dr. Cletus, you are recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member Shimkus, and members of the subcommittee for providing me the opportunity to testify here today. My name is Rachel Cletus, and I'm the Policy Director for the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. The science is clear. We need to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050 to help limit the risks of climate change, including worsening flooding, heat waves, wildfires, and sea level rise. Embracing a zero carbon energy future would also be a boon for the economy and for public health. If we do this right, we can help ensure that all communities will benefit from this transition. Reaching net zero emissions by 2050 will not be easy, and it will require sustained effort over decades. But a just and equitable low-carbon transition is both a necessary and achievable goal for the U.S. The U.S. can and must play a leading role in the global efforts, and right now we're far off track. The good news is that we have today many of the scalable technology solutions that we need to get on a path to net zero, and others are clearly on the horizon. Energy efficiency, renewable energy, electrifying energy end uses, and increasing carbon storage in lands and soils, for example. The costs of wind, solar, and battery storage have been falling dramatically over the past decade. To decarbonize the power sector, we need a diverse mix of zero-carbon technologies. Most analyses, including from UCS, show that renewable electricity plays a dominant role in decarbonizing the power sector and, by extension, the rest of the economy. Our analysis shows renewables reaching 70 to 80% of the generation mix by 2050, while conventional coal-fired power is phased out by 2030. Natural gas with CCS and nuclear will likely need to be part of the mix, although their role is constrained by costs, and we need to address associated safety, security, and social and environmental concerns. Significant investments in infrastructure are needed for this transition, but the near-term public health benefits will be immense. As renewables are ramped up, we have many tools available to ensure reliable and affordable integration of this generation. A key near-term challenge is how to avoid an over-reliance on natural gas, which is still a fossil fuel and has associated methane leakage, methane being a potent heat-trapping gas. The role of conventional natural gas must be contained within the next decade, else we risk blowing past our climate goals or have billions of dollars in stranded assets. Another near-term challenge highlighted in a 2018 UCS analysis, the nuclear power dilemma, is that more than one-third of existing U.S. nuclear plants face early retirement over the next decade and could be replaced by natural gas, risking a 6% rise in cumulative power sector emissions. A national carbon price or low-carbon electricity standard combined with strong safety standards could help limit this risk. The transportation sector is the leading contributor to U.S. heat-trapping emissions today. Therefore, cutting these emissions is essential. And that can be done by cleaning up vehicles and fuels through strong fuel economy and greenhouse gas emission standards and reducing the carbon content of fuels and rapidly transitioning to electrification while investing in low-carbon mass transit. The middle of the century can seem a long way off, but the reality is we must implement policies right now to drive down emissions and avoid locking in long-lived, carbon-intensive infrastructure. We need a robust, comprehensive, economy-wide suite of policies to scale up the many solutions we already have on hand, even as we invest in the research, development, and deployment of the portfolio of the next generation of zero-carbon technologies. Congress is already considering many types of these policies, including proposals for an RES, a CES, 100% clean energy, a range of carbon pricing proposals, and tax credit extensions. Done right, climate action can also help address long-standing inequities for low-income communities and communities of color that have borne a disproportionate burden of our dependence on fossil fuels. And we can also unleash the benefits of clean energy in these communities. We must invest in just transition policies for fossil fuel-dependent workers and communities. It's now time for bold and comprehensive action. Our choices today will determine the kind of climate future we leave our children and grandchildren. Last week, UCS released an analysis, Killer Heat in the United States, that shows that if we fail to sharply curtail global heat-trapping emissions, rapid, widespread increases in extreme heat are projected to occur across the country. However, if we dramatically cut emissions, we can greatly limit the intensity of the coming heat. Our nation just celebrated the 50th anniversary of humans landing on the moon, an amazing testament to American vision, ingenuity, and courage. That's the can-do spirit we have to bring to the challenge before us today. We're greatly encouraged by this committee's leadership, look forward to seeing Congress enact robust legislation, and we thank you, Chairman Tonko, Rush, and Pallone, for the bold vision that you laid out yesterday.
Thank you, Dr. Cletus. That concludes witness opening statements. We now will move to member questions, each member having 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. A number of members have stated support for achieving economy-wide net zero emissions by 2050, and obviously we want to get there sooner, if possible. Now, my request here is to have each of you briefly give your perspective on this target. Is it ambitious? Is it aligned with the global scientific consensus? Is it achievable if we get started as soon as possible? And how difficult will it be to achieve? So, Dr. Hausker, we'll start with you, please.
Thank you. I'll preface my response by saying there's a lot of young people in the audience, and in fact, 2 of my daughters are behind me, and a niece. And we have a moral obligation to get to net zero by 2050 and leave them a climate that is not disrupted. And frankly, our generation has dithered for 30 years since I was a Senate staffer in 1988, and Jim Hansen testified before the Senate Energy Committee. So we need to get going on this. In terms of timing, it is a 30-year multi-sector transformation. I think the hearings that you're going to conduct over the next months will establish a good fact-based foundation for what can we do by 2030 realistically? What can we do by 2040 realistically? Where can we deploy technologies fully commercial in a big way now versus what do we need to aim for by 2030? And I hinted at that in my testimony. We can go into more details, but as several of us have noted, we have fully commercialized at low cost wind and solar. We can deploy that like crazy. We are on the edge of breakthroughs in CCS that will allow us to scale up in the 2020s to the kind of magnitudes that my colleague Shannon described. There's longer term research that we will need for things we need to deploy in the 2040s and beyond. So it is a mixture. As someone said, there's no single policy, there's no single technology that's going to do this. I think all of us look forward to working with you in further hearings. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Angelski?
So I will just build on what Dr. Hausker was just saying, but I think if we look to the lessons learned from the wind and solar industry, it took 25 years for that industry to actually commercialize. And with that 25 years, there was significant investment by the U.S. in those technologies, both for innovative research as well as tax credits and deployment policies, as well as at the state and regional level to actually create markets for the sale of that electricity. So again, to my point, my testimony was sustained and I think aggressive policy support. We're already there with carbon capture. It's not 25 years from now that we're talking about. We're talking about another 10 years. We just need to build on the success of 45Q, continue to innovate, and do more projects.
Thank you. Mr. Cohen?
Mr. Chairman, totally feasible and proof of concept, 3 examples in history. Sweden, Ontario, and France virtually decarbonized their grid in 20 years. Okay, and they did it with a combination of technologies. We can do it if we decide to.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Cletus?
Net zero by 2050 is an essential floor for an ambitious U.S. contribution to global efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 C. The reality is we're hurtling to well over 3 C right now. And even right now at 1 C, we're seeing terrible impacts across our nation: flooding, heat waves, droughts, sea level rise. This is not a moment to lower the bar on ambition. We need to raise ambition as much as possible. It is not going to be easy, but the problem is not technology. I think we've all laid out that there are many pathways. We have the technologies available. It's feasible. The challenge is political will. We're really encouraged to see this particular subcommittee take this issue seriously because it's political will that we need right now.
Thank you. And 2 of the top-line messages we're hearing today is that everyone believes in order to achieve this target, we must first take an inclusive view of clean energy technologies, and second, implement policies that result in emissions reductions from all sectors of the economy. I'm certain that everyone here has slightly different preferred pathways to decarbonization, but does everyone agree with these 2 overarching points, and how important are they to keep in mind as we think through policy specifics? Dr. Cletus, why don't we start with you and work backward?
We have the technologies available, and the core of them is a zero-carbon technology transition in our energy sector. Renewables will play a dominant role, as I said, but we will need to be fully risk-averse and be sure that we will hit our climate targets. We need to have a diverse mix of zero-carbon technologies on the table.
Thank you. Mr. Cohen?
Completely agree, and I would just say there are 2 halves to this equation. There's innovation to get that diverse portfolio, but there's also market pull. Innovation by itself is not going to get the pace we need.
Thank you. And Ms. Angelski?
I would say that it relates to carbon capture. We already have the 45Q incentives that actually put a price on capturing and storing CO2, so that's a good start, and I would encourage incentivizing more of that.
Okay, and finally, Dr. Hausker.
And your analogy is completely right. We need the broad portfolio, just like in financial investments and just like if you're in Vegas. Don't put all your chips on 1 or 2 slots.
Thank you very much. And now I recognize Mr. Shimkus for 5 minutes. Our clock will keep you posted if it's offset.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For Ms. Angelski, in February hearing this year on addressing climate change, Rick Powell of ClearPath testified, and I quote, "The expected emissions growth from developing Asian countries alone would offset a complete decarbonization of the U.S. economy by mid-century." Do you agree with that statement?
I will say that the IEA has actually just recently issued more analysis that came to the same conclusion.
In that same hearing, Ms. Angelski, we heard testimony that fossil energy will remain a major part of the energy mix in growing nations like India, Vietnam, Colombia, South Africa, because the sources are domestic, abundant, and affordable. From a technological standpoint, what does it take for the United States to help these nations continue to use fossil energy and reduce emissions?
So there are a variety of technology approaches that could be undertaken. Those countries are still emerging economies, so they are looking for the lowest cost possible opportunity to generate energy. In many cases, that's with coal. And so if they could adopt more highly efficient coal systems, And when we can actually export lower-cost carbon capture technologies and help them implement it, I think those are the opportunities that we can evaluate, as that infrastructure in those countries will be very young. So they will have those assets on the ground that will continue to operate for many years.
Will it be easier for us to help them with a robust economy or a weak economy?
From our perspective, a robust economy will also help us to invest in the innovation that we need in order to export those technologies and help them to utilize them.
Thank you. Let me go to Mr. Cohen. On your testimony on page 4 shows a chart, and I think we were going to try to put it up on here so everyone could see it on the screen, about the change in primary energy demand globally. The U.S. is in decline. So this is the, I don't know if it's going to get put up. It's up. Oh. Well, and I hope, anyway, you're going to have to turn around to see it, but you know it because but this is a million tons of oil equivalency. So this is IEA, International Energy Agency, World Energy Outlook. And so for until 2040, and says it shows U.S. would look at a 30 million tons oil equivalent decline, where you have those other countries and an increase.
Right.
I think we just have to have that in perspective. I think the technology debate we're having today is very, very important, because we need to be the leader, and then we can export to these areas that they're going to move in the fossil fuel sector, regardless of what we do. Mr. Cohen?
Yeah, and Representative, I think the point of the visual was actually that it's going to need to be cheap, too. Developing countries are likely not going to pay a big premium for clean energy. So the commercialization process that we do in the U.S., just as we did for wind and solar to drive costs down, is going to go viral around the world, hopefully.
Thank you, and I'll just end on this. The unspoken word, although it was mentioned once or twice, is nuclear. It has to be a huge part of the portfolio. You can't talk about France's decarbonizing without its 80% portfolio of nuclear generation. So we need to work on that from our side too, because we don't have a very consistent message to nuclear power in our country right now. With that, Madam Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, the Chairman. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, full committee chairman, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about a technology-neutral approach and also about natural gas. So yesterday, the committee announced our intention, as you know, to chart a legislative path towards a 100% clean economy defined as net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And this is the target that the science says we must achieve if we're to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, avoiding the worst effects of climate change. And I know this is going to be a challenge, but I think we can do it. So let me start out on the technology-neutral approach. Dr. Hausker, you covered this in your testimony. Could you just explain why we should take a technology-neutral approach to comprehensive climate policy?
Yes, I think I'll contrast it to there are some very serious people in the climate policy community who would like us to commit to 100% renewable energy as the solution. And then there's another group of equally serious people that say we should take a technology-neutral approach, leaving the door open to things like nuclear and carbon capture on fossil fuels. And the reason that I am in the camp of a technology-neutral approach is that we are likely to hit some obstacles if we try to lock in just a narrow set of technologies, just renewables only. It may be possible to supply all the world's needs with 100% renewable. One can't predict the future with certainty, but it is much less risky to invest in multiple technologies that can get us there, as long as we manage all of the environmental issues. There are not only just CO2, but there's other issues related to fossil fuel extraction and combustion. With nuclear, we need to make sure the plants are safe and that we can safely store the waste and control proliferation problems. But particularly, it will be very difficult to keep costs affordable and go to 100% renewables. We can go deeper into that if the committee wishes.
All right. I wanted to ask some of the others about this too, but I have to get to natural gas. So if anyone else wants to briefly comment and answer the question about the technology-neutral approach. Mr. Cohen?
Yeah, may I just add a couple points to Carl's comment? First of all, as I set out in my testimony, I would go a little farther and say the vast majority of studies that have looked at the electricity sector have concluded that firm zero-carbon energy, non-weather dependent, whether it's nuclear or carbon capture, is going to bring costs down. And there are some outlier studies that suggest that, but I would say that that is a distinct minority of the studies out there. Second point is, renewables are great for electricity, not entirely clear how you decarbonize cement, steel, or how you decarbonize all of heavy freight with renewable energy. So there's some, even if you could do 100% electricity, 100% renewable on the electricity grid, there are other sectors to worry about.
All right, I'm gonna move on because I want to ask about the role of natural gas. Dr. Cletus, in your testimony, you discussed the near-term challenge of avoiding an over-reliance on natural gas. Could you explain your concern with this scenario and why it should be a problem, why it could be a problem for meeting our 100 by 50 goal?
So the reality is right now in the U.S., we're seeing a tremendous build-out of natural gas infrastructure. It is one of the drivers for the significant amounts of coal retirements we've seen. It has helped integrate renewables online. So there's definitely a role for natural gas. The problem is that if we look ahead and we look at the fact that natural gas is still a fossil fuel, comes with CO2 emissions, a coal-to-gas switch will just not be enough to meet our climate goals. And further compounding that problem is that we have these methane emissions from natural gas that are leaking, very potent greenhouse gas heat-trapping emission. And that could mean that just by natural gas being built out in this way, conventional natural gas, we could completely blow past our climate goals. We have to get our arms around this problem and limit this unmitigated build-out of conventional natural gas. Natural gas with CCS in our modeling shows up as it could be a contributor to a net zero world. That's the way in which we need to be leaning.
All right, I appreciate it. Now, Mr. Cohen, you touch on this issue in your testimony, and you stress the importance of eliminating super pollutants such as methane. Do you want to elaborate on the importance of addressing the methane emissions in order to meet our 100 by 50 target?
As I set out in the testimony, the problem with methane is that it's 87 times more powerful as a warming pollutant per unit than CO2. So very important, if we use natural gas and we decarbonize it with CCS, but we leave the methane out there, we're not doing ourselves any favors from a climate standpoint. The agenda before us is pretty straightforward. First of all, the EPA has regulated or has regulations in place to deal with new sources of natural gas, but that's only about 20% of the total. We need to extend those regulations to cover existing wells. We also need a lot of RD&D to really button up that system and make it zero methane leakage. And there are many things we could talk about in future hearings that would do that.
Thank you. Thank all of our witnesses.
Colleagues, I just wanted to bring to the attention of the room that unfortunately we're having a little difficulty with our clock system. So we have come up with a solution. We're using stopwatches back here, so you're going to have to trust me that your 5 minutes are up. Having said that, I now recognize Mr. Long.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering about that clock situation. We can watch it here, and it'll go up and it'll go down, and I didn't know what was possessing it. But I'm from Springfield, Missouri, and in Springfield, Missouri, back in the 1950s, there was a nationwide, the first country television show called Ozark Jubilee, and on Ozark Jubilee, stars would come in from all around the country. Red Foley made it big there, Porter Wagner, on and on. There's a little restaurant, Aunt Martha's Pancake House, because Aunt Martha performed on the Jubilee, so she opened a pancake house, and this guy came to town, and he couldn't make it on the Jubilee, and he said, well, I'll prove to him I can make it. So he went over to Aunt Martha's, got a job washing dishes for quite some time, and every week he'd go back and audition, and they said, you have no talent. So Willie Nelson left town, but Aunt Martha's remained. And during the time when we went to no smoking in Springfield, Missouri, the people that owned Aunt Martha's at that time weren't real fond of the new no smoking policy. And so you'd go in there and you'd sit at a non-smoking table, which most people like. Table next to you was smoking. The next one was non-smoking. The next one was smoking, non-smoking. So it sort of defeated the purpose. And I use that analogy to think if you've traveled to China, if you've traveled to India, those are the type of things that complicate this whole climate change and trying to clean up the environment, because if you're clean at your table and not smoking, it really doesn't do you much good when the next table's allowed to smoke and put out those kind of pollutants. Mr. Cohen, I'd like to focus on how we can reduce carbon dioxide emissions while keeping energy and commodity prices low, particularly in rural and agricultural communities like those I represent. In my home state of Missouri, coal-fired power plants provide 73% of our electricity and provided 73% of our electricity in 2018. This is an improvement from 2017, where coal produced 81% of our electricity, so going from 81 to 73 is moving in the right direction. But as we talk about decarbonizing the whole economy, while electric generation seemingly gets most of the attention, it only makes up, as has been mentioned here today, about 40% of the emissions we produce. You say in your testimony that a carbon-free energy system requires essentially zeroing out energy-related greenhouse emissions from all sectors of the economy by 2050. When you think about agriculture, do we currently have the technology to decarbonize the agricultural industry while continuing to produce and move goods to market without harming consumers? I can see electric cars, I can see Volts, I can see Teslas, I can see electric cars moving up and down the interstate system, but as I'm driving down that interstate system and I look out to the fields and the massive tractors and horsepower required, is that practical, and where are we on that?
Yeah, let me just caveat and say, I probably should have said at the outset, I'm really much more expert on the energy system, and ag is not my field, but let me just give you one example. So right now, actually, the agriculture uses ammonia fuel for farm equipment on quite an extensive basis. That's quite interesting because ammonia is potentially a zero carbon or zero emitting fuel. It's made from hydrogen and combined with nitrogen, and you've got ammonia, and it's used for fertilizer, obviously, but also so we actually have an example of essentially a zero carbon combusted zero carbon fuel in the ag sector. Expanding that would be a really big step throughout the ag sector and actually throughout the economy. As far as I think other people on the panel are more expert on soil management and cropping and low carbon agriculture and methane capture from livestock and so forth. But I do think that there are certainly areas to go in, but I honestly am not deep on that. My focus is on energy.
Let me ask Dr. Is it Hosker, the same question as far as the practicality of electrification of the agricultural industry. You mentioned low carbon and zero carbon in your opening comments, and can you kind of explain what that would look like in the agricultural community?
Sure. I think you're putting your finger on some end uses, some sectors that will be the more difficult to decarbonize. Some agriculture applications of energy, heavy-duty transport, and jet fuel will all be more challenging to find solutions to than the other examples you cite. Like, we know how to have electric heat pumps for buildings, electric water heaters, electric cars. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit that seems ready for commercialization. But there are things, here's where we need an innovation agenda, and building off of some things that my colleague Armand said, we know how to make synthetic methane. And one of the feedstocks could be CO2 that we capture through other uses. We know how to use ammonia potentially as a fuel. We ultimately can make hydrogen as a fuel. And all of these have potential applications in those more difficult to decarbonize end uses like you cite.
We've talked a lot about carbon capture on this committee over the years, and it looked like it was pretty slow to get to first base, but now that it's starting to move, can you kind of bring us up to date on where we are on carbon capture and what that looks like going forward?
Yeah, I'll give a quick answer, and then I want to defer to my colleague Shannon, who I think has deeper knowledge on this. But you've heard a couple of examples here of plants that are already in operation. We know that the oil and gas industry has injected CO2 into old oil and gas fields for decades and safely stored that. We know that we have plants being demonstrated now, and we know that we have a very promising demonstration of natural gas with CCS at the 50 megawatt demonstration level in Texas, and that's the net power example that I cited. So we are, I think, at the cusp of really commercializing CCS. And let me...
The gentleman, this time has actually expired. We'll probably pick up on those questions as we move along. And I now recognize myself, the gentlelady from New York, for my questions for 5 minutes at this time. And I want to thank Chairman Tonko and Ranking Member Shimkus for convening this extremely important hearing on what we can and must do across our entire economy to cut greenhouse gas emissions and put an end to the environmental pollution that is harming our communities and driving our climate crisis. Thank you as well to you, our witnesses, for being here today. The world right now is facing a climate emergency. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we have until the year 2030 to make rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes to limit greenhouse gas emissions and to avoid the worst effects of climate change by 2050. But we don't need to wait until 2050 to feel the effects of climate change. We don't even need to wait until 2030. The climate crisis is happening right now, and communities across our nation are already suffering the consequences, especially our low-income communities and communities of color who are on the front lines of this crisis. In my home city of Brooklyn, New York, thousands of families were displaced when Superstorm Sandy struck our communities back in 2012, flooding entire neighborhoods and critically damaging our subway systems and other critical infrastructure. Even today, many families still have been unable to come back to their homes. And just this weekend, like Chairman Pallone, in my district and neighboring communities in Brooklyn, we faced blackouts due to the prolonged overheating, if you will, extreme temperatures that have hit the northeast region of the United States, driving a number of communities to really suffer as a result of these blackouts. Overwhelmed infrastructure, overwhelmed energy grids, old infrastructure, we know that if we really put our minds to it, we can address. The key to avoiding the greatest human and economic costs of climate change crisis, as my city has learned, is to take action before it is too late. Earlier this year, New York City passed its own Green New Deal, if you will, committing $14 billion in clean investments that will safeguard our communities and spur thousands of good-paying jobs. And New York City is not alone. Just last week, New York State passed the most ambitious state-level climate legislation in the nation with the goal of decreasing our economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 85% by the year 2050. We're trying to do our part. So I applaud these recent achievements in New York City and New York State, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee to accomplish similar climate action on the federal level. Having said that, my first question is to Mr. Cohen. According to the EPA, emissions from transportation have actually been increasing since 2012. In fact, as of 2016, the transportation sector has officially become the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. I find this deeply concerning. Do you share my concern? What do you believe are the greatest challenges and opportunities for vehicle electrification in the United States, and what can Congress do to help encourage this transition?
So yes, it is a concern, and in fact, as electric power gets cleaner, obviously the transportation wedge will be comparatively larger. So there are really two paths, right? There's electrification and then clean up the grid, and then there's some kind of fuel that you drop into a combustion engine, and I think we're going to need both. So my top line would be something like a low-carbon fuel standard that requires increasing shares of zero-carbon fuel for transportation throughout the country over time, give the industry time to adapt, and then put in the necessary RD&D dollars to make sure that those zero-carbon fuels are available. I think it can be technology neutral, it could be electricity, it could be hydrogen, it could be ammonia, it could be biofuels that are climate beneficial, but we need a market driver to make that happen. We can't conserve our way out of the transportation problem. Efficiency is good, but it's not going to get us to zero.
It's my opinion that we don't simply need to build a clean clean future. Instead, we need to build a clean and equitable future. New York State recently signed climate legislation attempts to move towards this goal by prioritizing new investments in disadvantaged communities and also by ensuring that no solutions are implemented which might increase the burden on low-income communities or communities of color. Dr. Cletus, in your testimony today, you talked about the need for just and equitable socioeconomic transition. Can you speak a little more about what this means in terms of decarbonizing the economy, and how do we ensure this massive transformation of the economy benefits all communities and does not continue to negatively impact low-income communities and communities of color?
We have an opportunity here as we address the climate crisis to make sure that we do it in a just and equitable way. In fact, that is the pathway to address the climate crisis. Just last week, there was an equitable and just national climate platform that was released by a number of environmental justice and national environmental groups. It lays out some core principles that point out that as we address climate change, we can cut and we should cut pollution directly in communities that have borne a disproportionate burden of our dependence on fossil fuels. Fence-line communities that are in the path of the smokestacks are seeing vehicle emissions in their communities that have led to high asthma rates and other cancers in their communities. So it's really, really fundamental and important that we aren't just talking about cutting emissions and technology changes, but deep socioeconomic changes that move us towards a more just society and address longstanding inequities. It's a big opportunity. There are lots of twofers. We can build low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure in these communities that will help protect people, clean up the air and water, and make sure that they are full participants in a clean energy economy.
Thank you. I yield back my time, and now the chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all of our witnesses. We have 2 hearings going on simultaneously, so some of us have to bounce back and forth. Ms. Angelski, Republicans have been briefed by Department of Energy on some of the exciting new technologies that are there to extract carbon from the atmosphere, including one that would be a simple membrane to potentially remove carbon dioxide from coal emissions. What's necessary to accelerate development of those technologies, and what do you think the impact could be of them?
So I think from an innovation standpoint, I think that we could look at increasing some of the budgets that the Department of Energy currently receives for carbon capture. That would be on the research side. I think we also need larger budgets to accommodate and support the scale-up and testing of those technologies at a commercial scale. We need to do some pilot work. We do have something called the National Carbon Capture Center that's operated by Southern Company and supported by DOE, where we can test some of those technologies at a smaller scale, but we don't have that sort of mid-level scale testing capability. And so a lot of these technologies that are individual technologies are looking to partner at power plant sites. So if we were to have more test facilities and the federal investment going into those scale-up opportunities, I think that we could really see some of these innovative technologies being accelerated in terms of commercialization. And I also just want to mention that there is one that's already operating on natural gas right now called Net Power that Carl Hausker referenced. But it's at that scale and size of testing that we really need to understand how these technologies are going to operate to be able to benefit from them.
Can I ask each of you, and because of limited time, we'll try and keep this short, but do you all believe that nuclear power is a key part of the solution here? Just sort of yes or no, if you could.
I will say yes, both the existing plants have a role to play, and I think with sufficient RD&D, we could probably bring a new generation.
Like you referenced with NuScale, yeah.
Members of Kirk look at the diverse generation portfolio, so that includes nuclear.
Okay, Mr. Cohen?
Yes, but there's a lot of work to do.
Right. Dr. Cletus?
Nuclear power can play a role, but UCS has long been a nuclear safety watchdog, and safety must be central to how we deploy nuclear power.
Right, of course, of course. I want to go to the fleet, because transportation is such a big part of this. I think we are making gains on the power generation side, and I hope, we're all hopeful innovation will lead there. We have manufacturing issues to deal with on emissions, but what about the transportation fleet? And there are various proposals out there. Some call for, raising the cost of driving basically with higher fuel taxes and all. Do you all support that sort of concept? And if so, what do you think that number needs to be on a per gallon cost?
If I can take the question in a slightly different direction, which is, more broadly speaking, we need some kind of price on carbon as a sort of foundational policy to shift the economy. That can be done through fees and taxes. That can be done through cap and trade. There's a very rich debate out there, but we need a price on carbon.
All right. I just want to get each of you briefly. I've got another question after that.
I won't comment on transportation fuels. It's just not within
Not
the
your
mission.
deal. Okay. Mr. Cohen?
I would take a much more innovation-focused approach. I would sort of see if we can push technologies through the pipeline, like I've discussed, to get the costs down so that the delta isn't as big. I think some evidence is that even if you had a fairly high carbon tax in the economy, you probably wouldn't do much to move
So you're not
transportation.
advocating for that for
Not
the
at this
vehicle fleet, Dr. Cleet?
To decarbonize the transportation sector, we've got to address the vehicles, we've got to address the fuels, and we've got to address the infrastructure, including electrification infrastructure, as well as building out mass transit. A carbon price alone will not help accomplish those goals. So we do need fuel economy standards, greenhouse gas standards. We need electric vehicle tax incentives. We need to be investing in the kind of infrastructure that'll help electrify as much of the electric fleet as possible.
I want to ask about the agricultural sector as well. Some of the recommendations that have been put forth by some groups basically call for the elimination of cattle grazing because of cattle production. Do you all support that concept? I've only got 22 seconds for all of you, so.
I don't think we should be just eliminating classes of food. There's other things we can do smarter.
Within Kirk, so I'm going to pass.
All right.
I'm going to pass on that. We haven't looked at that deeply.
All right.
There are serious proposals for how we can cut emissions and how the agricultural sector can play a big role, including through better soil management and agricultural practices to store carbon better in soils.
What about cattle specific?
I don't think that is actually a serious proposal. I think there are serious proposals out there, and we should certainly explore them to help limit these emissions if we're serious about tackling climate change.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The chair recognizes Mr. Peters for 5 minutes to ask his questions at this time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to say, first of all, I'm very happy to have this hearing. I've been among a number of people who've been frustrated with the dominance of politics and the lack of solutions. Today, it looks like we're actually having a discussion about a range of solutions to deal with this issue. I think it couldn't come soon enough. I also want to acknowledge that I think that the concerns raised by my Republican colleagues about foreign policy in India and China are 100% legitimate. We ought to be working on what we can do as a matter of foreign policy to discourage the implementation of the use of coal in particular, but to encourage the use of renewables so that they come along with what we discover here. And I want to talk about two things I'm emphasizing just briefly on. One is super pollutants. I mean, I think one of the things that we've talked about here is that we know natural gas burns cleaner than coal. That's seen as an advantage, but if we lose the benefit because of methane emissions, I think we're hurting ourselves. And the opportunity in methane emissions and with all these short-lived super pollutants is that they are short-lived, so that if you can keep them from getting into the atmosphere, they don't persist like carbon dioxide. You can have a really quick impact, relatively quick impact on the rate of climate change. And so I think that's something that deserves a lot of emphasis here. But I want to talk a little bit about negative emissions technologies, since I think almost all of you addressed that, and that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. I addressed the first question to Mr. Cohen. One of the concerns about carbon capture technologies is that it's too expensive to implement on a large scale, and moreover, that the technology as it exists today doesn't work as advertised. Ms. Angelski talked about this a little bit, but could you discuss what carbon capture activities are currently taking place in the United States and what both industry and government are doing to bring down the costs of those carbon capture projects?
Right. I have global numbers, which is that globally there are now 18 fully commercial carbon capture units on industry and power around the world. I believe 5 are under construction and some 30 are, and then 20 are in the various stages of development. In the United States, we have at least one very large-scale power example, Petronova project near Houston. Took my board to see it. You can see the CO2 pipe going in the ground. It's actually very instructive to actually say it's actually just a pipe, and it's a bunch of chemical towers. So clearly we can do it. There are dozens of injection projects around the country to prove that we can keep it underground. So the technology, I don't think there's any debate about that with current technology we can do this and we can store it underground, and there's been lots of monitoring projects. The real challenge is bringing the costs down, and that's just a question of really scale up. It's the solar and wind story, basically. Can you keep driving numbers and numbers and numbers to the point where you get, with the learning by doing, you get to a better price point? The company that did the project in Houston has said that they believe that if they did a second unit, they could bring the cost down 30% just based on what they learned from the first unit. It's just a learning curve problem in our view. So it's going to be a lot of continued support, probably from the federal government and from state governments, to just build that out and get to a point where we're in mass production.
Ms. Angelski, I appreciate you mentioning the Use It Act, which actually has been passed by the Senate, and we could pass it. We could pass it here in the House. It would be great. Can you talk about the role of that in terms of advancing this technology and how you think that might be helpful?
So there's really two main components of that bill that I think are really interesting. One is that you are authorizing research for direct air capture as well as for carbon. If you capture carbon and you convert it into some other useful products. And so that to me would really help to accelerate those technologies and, as I said in my testimony, transform the way that we're currently using carbon and create it into marketable products, which is something that would really contribute to the deep decarbonization objectives that we're talking about. The other aspect of that bill would be to streamline permitting for projects, and that would be both for carbon capture project infrastructure, also as well for the pipelines that are needed to move around the CO2.
Just for those people who aren't maybe not familiar with the technology, can you explain what the role of pipelines is in this sector? These are carbon dioxide pipelines.
Sure. So once you need infrastructure to capture carbon dioxide from an industrial flue gas stream, and once you capture it, you have to do something with it.
Right.
And so the most common way of moving CO2 is you pressurize it and you put it into a supercritical state. So it's almost like a liquid fuel. And that typically is moved through pipelines. And as I mentioned in my testimony, we have about 4,500 miles of carbon dioxide pipelines currently operating in this country. So we have existing infrastructure that we can tap into.
But it needs to be expanded, right? I'm going to run out of time.
It does. Exactly.
I'll just say, I look forward to someday even talking about what else we might do with that carbon. But
Yes.
for the time being, I'll yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the panel for joining us today. One of the things we don't celebrate is where the United States actually is, where we've come from, and the point we've achieved today. And we've done it through innovation and through a focus on conservation, resiliency, and preparation. One of the things where I think we've been deficient is trying to figure out how to export that to the rest of the world, and I think we need to do that. I'll give you a personal example of where I am. I commissioned a solar system on my home in late 2009. That immediately reduced my net electricity usage by 40%. And since then, from 2013 to 2018, I was looking at my power monitoring system, did a quick and dirty spreadsheet, and I've reduced my net electricity usage by another 42%, and that's by switching to LED, tweaking the way our home automation system works, also tweaking the way we use our air conditioning, and so forth. So, I mean, this is very achievable to do this, we did that without any sort of government mandates or taxes. What we did it through is through conservation and innovation, and I think we need to think about that as we pursue this, and I also agree we need to look at it on a technologically neutral basis. One of the things I didn't hear, I heard some about nuclear, but I didn't really get the impression that there was as much enthusiasm about nuclear as I think we all need to look at. We're not going to produce baseload power. I think it was Mr. Cohen, you had the chart to show California's examples. we're not going to produce enough power on a cost-effective basis by using 100% renewables. If we really want to have baseload power, we need to look at nuclear. Another thing we need to look at is the land use impact of renewables. For instance, for every acre it takes to produce nuclear power, it takes 3.5 acres to produce this equivalent amount of solar, and it takes 5.7 to produce acres to produce the same amount of wind, and 25.3 acres to produce the same amount of hydro. And the only one of those that's conceivably close to being baseload is hydro. So we need to look, I think, more broadly at nuclear. That's the reason we had the Advanced Nuclear Fuels Act to fuel the next generation of reactors that passed the House in the last Congress. It's also passed this committee, and hopefully it'll pass the entire Congress, will be signed up by the President in this Congress. Mr. Wahlberg and Mr. Crenshaw and I introduced the Leading Act, and incentivizes R&D in carbon capture technologies, and that allows us to fully harness the environmental benefits of America's vast natural gas resources. I do have some, we talk about the macro situation. I look at the NASA Earth Observatory website, and it appears that total CO2 emissions from nature and man, or humankind, are about 219 gigatons a year, and the total sequestration is about 215 gigatons a year, which means we're emitting about 4 gigatons a year into the atmosphere, net, that's not being sequestered. So when we talk about sequestration of that amount, I'd like to get an idea from y'all as the cost of sequestration today and where you think it'll be in 2050, if you're qualified to if you feel comfortable talking about that. I'd like to get that answered in terms of trees and nature, direct atmospheric or air removal, and then CCUS from fossil fuels. Do y'all have a feel for that cost today, cost per ton for CO2 removal?
I think we can, I think Shannon can perhaps speak to the, for direct capture from flue gas. I guess, Shannon, I think my guess is something in the range of $50 to $100 would be a fair, per ton would be a fair number.
At least the testimony that I provided, my written testimony refers to recent IEA analysis that looks at some of those costs, and it's the break-even cost for capture and storage application, and they range from anywhere from $5 per ton of CO2 that's stored upwards of 60. I would say that I think some people think that these numbers are somewhat low from practical application, but there's at least a range that you can look at, and that's for carbon capture.
Okay.
And the gigaton scale that I mentioned in my testimony, that will be needed, or at least projected by IEA, that's needed to be captured and stored is from industrial uses is 100 gigatons. That doesn't take into account other technologies that will contribute to that gigaton reduction that's needed.
Okay. Mr. Housker, you talked about direct removal from the atmosphere, the air. What's the cost for that today? And I know this is pie in the sky stuff, but we know that technology will bend the cost curve down. Where do you think that could be in 2050?
Some of the most recent engineering studies of what we could do with direct air capture is in the range of $200 per ton, I believe. Professor David Keith recently issued a study. So yes, as we go to scale and learn on almost any technology, costs tend to come down. So it's very promising.
This gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Barragan of California for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to start the witnesses by being here today and for holding this hearing, which I think is so critically important. I was glad to see the committee yesterday make its announcement of moving forward on this issue. You know, I happen to represent a district that is very working class, a district that is majority minority. It's the type of district that's been on the front lines of disproportionately being impacted by climate change and air pollution. And so to be able to see us address this in a way that's just and fair, I think is so critically important. I want to start, my colleague started by saying he was concerned about the cost of what we were going to move forward with and harmful impacts of regulation. And I often tell people about the cost on people's lives. How do you put a price tag? How do you put a cost on the public health impacts that are being, that our families and that our communities are being negatively impacted on? In my district, we see cancer rates go up. We see asthma rates go up. As a matter of fact, the doctor's offices, they keep the boxes of asthma inhalers just waiting for children to come by to give them out. And so, so critically important. My first question is, you know, my district is surrounded by 3 freeways and the Port of Los Angeles. Looking at Mr. Cohen, you provided some visual aids, and thank you for that. I'm a visual learner. The emissions coming from the transportation sector. We had a hearing here not long ago about the administration's rolling back of the clean fuel standards. Maybe we can start with you, Mr. Cohen. Do you think that rolling these back is going to help us move in a positive direction to try to get to decarbonizing the economy?
Certainly not. It's moving us backwards. I would even argue that we need to move a great deal more forward, and I suggested something like a low-carbon fuel standard that would address the fuel as well as the efficiency. But you mentioned the Port of LA, and that's a good example of what could be done. The Port of LA has taken enormous efforts to electrify both the ships in berth as well as the landside vehicles to reduce emissions, and they're also piloting hydrogen-powered freight at the port. So those are 2 examples of where you could very concretely start to drive down local emissions from transportation.
Great, thank you. Dr. Cletus, maybe you can weigh in on the rollback of the administration's clean fuel standards?
This administration's posture on climate change is egregious, from denying the science to rolling back pretty much all the important policies we had on the books to address climate change. It's been really deeply dismaying and does such a disservice to people around the country today and to our children and grandchildren. The fuel economy and emission standards are key. No other current federal policy is delivering greater global warming emission reductions than these standards. So it is a huge problem that the administration wants to roll those back. We need to keep them on the books. We need to set strong standards going forward to make sure that over time our vehicles are getting cleaner and cleaner. And this will also benefit consumers because it will save them money at the gas pump.
Thank you. There was a lot of conversation about a carbon price, a carbon fee. Environmental justice groups have had a lot of concerns. I have some concerns about the impacts of that on low-income communities and it being a regressive tax. I'm running low on time, so I'm not going to have an opportunity to ask more about that. But I do hope to follow up with you all about this because I often think that communities of color, low-income communities are not at the table to express their concerns on this. And so would certainly like to hear more about what we can do. Are there ways to avoid that to get to where we need to get to? But what I want to spend my last few seconds here on is my district also has a lot of industrial areas. The Alameda Corridor is there. As I mentioned, the port is there. I know one of you mentioned industrial areas, at least in your testimony. What suggestions do you have for industrial areas like my district to get to decarbonize?
There are 2 major, I don't know exactly what the composition of your industries are, but for cement, steel, petrochemicals, there are 2 major things you can do, huge levers. One is the substituting another fuel input for the heat you need for these processes. And again, that can be zero carbon hydrogen or ammonia or other zero carbon fuels. And then on the back end, we need carbon capture, which will actually capture the other pollutants as well, not just carbon.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Carter of Georgia for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for being here. Certainly as an important subject, one that we all need to pay close attention to. I want to start with you, Ms. Angelski. I'm sorry if I butchered that, but nevertheless, carbon capture technology. We've talked about that today, and it's certainly something that is talked about quite often, and it certainly has a promising role in what we're trying to do to reduce emissions. I wanted to ask you, assuming that coal plants continue to come offline, and I suspect they will, and we'll see more gas plants built, not only because of the abundance, but also because it is less emissions, if you will. Can the technology for carbon capture, can that be retrofitted onto existing plants?
It can. And in fact, carbon capture technologies, and what you're referring to is really primarily going to be called a post-combustion capture technology. Many of those technologies, as I mentioned earlier, are really agnostic to the source of the CO2. It's just the concentration of the CO2 in that flue gas that needs to be accommodated in that capture equipment. So you're just going to modify slightly the sorbent or solvent that's inside the equipment in order to capture it on gas plants, for example, or coal plants. So there's a leverage and investment opportunity. As importantly, they can be used in other industries. So as Armin mentioned, we're going to need it, carbon capture, in other industrial applications. So
how much do you capture?
It depends on the technology. Some of these technologies can capture almost up to 99 to almost all of the CO2 emissions that come out of a fuel gas stream. It's really a question of what the cost is to capture that much of the CO2 from just a process perspective, but the capability is there to achieve sort of a net zero emission.
Okay, good. In my district, in the 1st District of Georgia, on the coast of Georgia, we've got a large manufacturer, Mitsubishi Hitachi Power Systems, and they manufacture gas turbines. I've been out there to visit them. Very impressive what they do. Exceptional business and exceptional company. And as they're the most efficient gas turbines in the world that they're building out there. And as they continue their research and development and they get even better, they'll become more efficient. And when we're replacing older coal or gas-fired boilers, as well as older gas turbines, with these new, more efficient gas turbines, the ones that can cut CO2 emissions by nearly 70%, how much carbon capture technology can we fit into the gas plant model? Can we fit that in there?
There are a variety of different approaches that can be pursued with natural gas generation. Some of them are process technologies where you would, the turbine would be part of the overall energy conversion platform. So we had mentioned earlier Net Power, something called the alum cycle. That's one natural gas technology that would, in its own right, be very highly efficient, and then it just, a byproduct of that process is carbon capture already at pressure, so it just needs to be put into a pipeline and stored. There are other technologies, like we just mentioned, that are post-combustion technologies. So even with a very highly efficient gas plant, like you said, you may have a 70% emissions reduction from what you might be replacing that with, but you're still going to be emitting some amount of CO2.
Okay.
And you can still
great.
capture CO2 from those plants.
Mr. Cohen, I want to get to you very quickly before my time runs out, because I wanted to ask you, you made, in your testimony, you said the American grid is a third carbon-free between wind, solar, nuclear, and hydro. And in the state of Georgia, just north of my district, we're the only place in the country that's building 2 nuclear reactors at this time. So I feel like nuclear is a big part of what our future holds in the way of clean energy. And I just wanted to ask you, do you think we should be placing more of an emphasis on nuclear power, especially when you consider its stability and its output?
Yes, absolutely. I actually sit on the board of an organization called the Nuclear Innovation Alliance that has exactly that objective. There's a lot of work to do in terms of cheaper, faster, and more efficient reactors. We won't go into the Georgia situation. There were some important lessons learned.
Yeah.
But yes, that we absolutely, having that in our toolkit would be an enormous step forward.
And you're right, there's a lot of work left to do, but I would submit that perhaps the biggest work left for us to do and the largest obstacle and barrier for us to get over is just public acceptance of it. And how do we do that?
Well, I think cost is going to be an issue too. I think we need to prove that we can bring these things on time and at budget or anywhere close to budget. But I do think public acceptance is important. I do think that's changing, by the way. My generation probably was inclined against the technology. I talk to younger people who think climate is way more important than whatever concern they might have around the nuclear technology. I think it's shifting very rapidly.
I hope you're right. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from California is now recognized, Ms. Matsui, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'm really pleased that this committee is holding this hearing to explore the many areas in which we can make progress in reducing emissions and combating the climate crisis. And I must say, this was brought up before, but I think we know that one primary contributor to greenhouse gas emissions that is particularly concern and importance to all of us, especially to me, is the transportation sector. It's all around us. We know it. It's the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation emissions from heavy-duty vehicles, passenger cars, and shipping, aviation, and rail continue to rise and plague our cities with poor air quality. We've discussed it before. There are pragmatic and achievable solutions to significantly reduce emissions across the board, something I've consistently worked with. For instance, my bill is the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, and the one that I'm really concerned about now, the Clean and Efficient Cars Act, which really does ensure that we keep the standards in place as far as fuel economy and greenhouse gas emissions. And I really think that those are sort of the low-hanging fruit, and I think those are the kinds of things that we ought to keep focusing on. There are other things, too, that I want to talk about, too, and buildings electrification. I think that we need to make real progress in reducing emissions and electrification of buildings. Net zero buildings that utilize a combination of strategies to consume only as much energy as can be produced on site through renewable resources have tremendous potential in solving the climate crisis. My local utility, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, otherwise known as SMUD, is doing great work toward greening our buildings by incentivizing the switch from gas to electric to perform functions such as heating and drying. We should be encouraging that type of transition across the country and throughout the private sector. Mr. Cohen, are there adequate policies and programs in place at the federal level to incentivize the electrification of buildings, particularly within the private sector?
I don't consider myself an expert in that area. I'm not aware of any broad policies. I know there's some R&D focused on improving the technology, for example, for ground source heat pumps and that sort of thing.
Is anyone else aware of it?
At this point, most of our building codes and building standards tend to be at the local and state level. We do not yet have strong, uniform federal standards across the board. And the opportunity here is not just to make buildings efficient and electrify them. The opportunity is also to make them climate resilient in the process, especially in the face of the extreme weather events that we've been facing. Huge opportunity here, both in the private sector as well as in public housing, where communities of color and low-income communities are particularly at risk when extreme weather events affect these buildings.
So this is an opportunity for housing advocates to be involved in this too, as far as climate solutions. And
absolutely. Climate change touches everything in our economy and our society, and there's a real opportunity here to lean in on the building sector in terms of becoming more efficient and low carbon.
Right. I know we've been talking about carbon capture an awful lot, and I think that seems to be the buzzword now today. I think the National Academies of Sciences reported last year that the United States should launch a substantial research initiative to advance carbon dioxide removal through a full suite of approaches, such as reforestation and soil management, as well as scalable approaches like direct air capture and carbon mineralization. Now, we're seeing states across the country launch carbon capture programs. For instance, California Air Resources Board last fall adopted amendments to our low carbon fuel standard program to include a new CSS protocol that enable wider deployment of CSS technology. Mr. Hausker, how critical will a new research and development program on carbon dioxide removal be to meeting our climate objectives? Is this something we should be considering down the road, or is it time now for us to invest and develop these technologies?
It's time now to invest, again, depending on where what stage a particular technology is at. It may be a role for R&D at the federal government or for support through a tax mechanism like 45Q. But as I emphasized in my testimony, we can't wait till 2030 or 2040 to fully commercialize this. We need to act aggressively now.
So as you look at the future emissions trajectories, how important will scalable carbon dioxide removal approaches like direct air capture be to meeting our climate objectives? Is this an approach that is gradual, and I mean, we're starting it now.
We don't need to begin direct air capture now. We simply need to put in motion the forces that will let us begin to deploy it in the 2040, 2050 range. It is highly likely to be needed to remove carbon dioxide from the air in the mid-century range.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. I just really feel also that we have things that we can do today that we should keep doing, and, you know, we can't just wait for
Absolutely.
Okay, fine. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady from California yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I'd like to put a first slide up, please. All right, so this is the picture. And if you'll take a look at it, it's just to make a point. But it shows a diesel-powered van pulling a gasoline-powered generator plugged into an electric vehicle that has run out of juice. And the reason I put this up there is just to remind everyone that electricity has to be produced somehow. If we want to have more electrical vehicles on the road to lessen the carbon footprint, that electricity's got to be produced somehow. So it can be produced through a lot of different methods. Nuclear power, Mr. Cohen's talked about, and we're going to go back to that, by the way. Hydroelectric power. But there's a lot of Californians on this committee. Good luck building a hydroelectric dam in California under their policies. Good luck building another hydroelectric project in this country under the current EPA rules and regulations. I think it's going to be very difficult. You've got coal-fired power plants. You've got natural gas-fired power plants. You've got wind, solar. You've got small modular reactors that can come online. There's a lot of different ways to produce electricity. And I truly am an all of the above guy. I love wind and solar. I think it's groovy technology. I love the prospect of hydroelectric cars, hydrogen-powered cars, all these things. But also know that our economy demands a 24/7, 365 baseload power supply. And let's just accept the understanding that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, and that those renewables are intermittent. And so because of the intermittency, they have to be supplemented by something that will provide the 24/7 baseload power supply that Americans demand. Not just American manufacturing, but Americans. They like their refrigerator to have cold drinks in it. They like to have warm homes, cool homes, etc. But we see, you know, the trend sort of shifting. There's a city in California now that is banning natural gas. And so they're not going to allow new homes or new businesses to have natural gas to power their HVAC units or possibly to power their stoves to cook on. So Berkeley's actually moving their constituents toward more expensive and less efficient energy sources for their homes. HVACs that are powered by electricity are less efficient. Electricity is more expensive than natural gas. And the stoves are less efficient, and electricity is more expensive. So, thinking about electrical generation, let's shift gears and put the second slide up. I want to talk about nuclear energy and the important role it plays in the all of the above energy matrix. Now, my home state of South Carolina has 7 nuclear power reactors. They produce 95% of the state's emission-free electricity, 53% of our total electricity. In my district, Oconee Nuclear Station has 3 nuclear reactors. Let's just talk about one of those. 3 nuclear reactors provide 2,550 megawatts of carbon-free, continuous, always-on power for South Carolina, North Carolina. If we replace the Oconee Nuclear Station, which uses less than 2 square miles, with solar, it would require 107 square miles of land, nearly 4 times the size of our largest city in upstate Greenville. If we replace Oconee Nuclear Station with wind power, that will require over 854 square miles of land. That's more land than the entire county of Anderson, my largest county in my district. So this slide shows how you would replace one nuclear reactor that's 1,154 megawatts with wind. It would take 2,077 windmills, and there are 2,077 windmills on this graph. 2,077 windmills, 2 megawatt wind generators, to replace one solar reactor. think about the landmass that would take to provide the wind power for that one reactor. Nuclear power is emission-free. Mr. Cohen, how can we further more nuclear power to lessen our carbon emission as part of this energy matrix?
Yeah, that's probably a subject for another hearing. I would just say there are three things. One is let's get on with the RD&D demonstration of the next generation of reactors that will be less expensive and faster to build. Secondly, we need to address the U.S. waste problem, and well, those two would be a good running start.
Well, you mentioned earlier some of the things that are hampering nuclear power. In South Carolina, we were building 2 more nuclear reactors, and the company had to stop because regulations by the government during the construction process, not during the permit approval process, during the construction process, changed so much that the cost went up, and that had to be mothballed. So now we're not having that nuclear power generation to meet our future electrical needs. How do we overcome the regulatory environment within a cost-benefit application that will support the growth of the nuclear industry?
Look, we've been supporting much more performance-based regulation. I do think the situation in South Carolina is a little more complicated than that. It's probably a subject of another hearing. There's a lot of blame to go around on that. I don't
In a
think
5-minute, we have to, you can't be that complicated. In 5 minutes.
I don't think the NRC bears all the
The
blame
gentleman's
in that
time is
situation.
expired.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soto, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. We're here today, like with our press conference yesterday, we're here to act on climate and get to 100% clean energy by 2050. And that's going to take reducing carbon emissions to net zero. So we know the goals. We have been told by various scientific groups like the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, there are 4 main elements to decarbonization. 1, transition to low-carbon electricity system. 2, reduce emissions from transportation, buildings, and industrial sectors. 3, to deploy negative emissions measures. And 4, to reduce non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. So I just want to ask all the panelists first, do you all agree with these basic elements? Is this the recipe to get us to 100% clean energy by 2050? And we'll start from left to right.
C2ES is a great group, and it's a great report you cited. Their 4 strategies are sort of overlap with the 4 strategies I mentioned in my testimony, but it's not inconsistent. Everything I said was focused on the energy sector and CO2, but they highlight the need to reduce the non-CO2 emissions, which are also sometimes called super pollutants, and Armand has discussed those today.
So do you believe that's a basic recipe? We may argue over which should be more prioritized.
It's a good recipe. It's an equally good framing as the one I set out.
I can comment that, yes, we can transition to a low-carbon electric grid.
But would you say that this is a comprehensive list of the 4 elements that we need to work on, regardless of what priority everybody may have of these elements?
Yes, and looking at the sources of CO2, absolutely.
Mr. Cohen?
That's a complete solution, sir.
Dr. Cletus, is this is this the recipe right here?
So that's the technological solutions that we have to address this as a deep socioeconomic change as well. So we need just transition investments in communities that are going to be affected as we transition away from fossil fuels. We need policies that will center equity in how we deal with climate change. And we have a political challenge here in the United States as well as globally. So this is not just a technological problem, but yes, those are the core elements of decarbonizing the economy, which needs a whole suite of other changes alongside.
Thank you, Dr. Cletus, and we'll worry about the political challenges right here on this committee, but I appreciate you bringing them up. I wanted to follow up on some line of questioning that Representative Peters has already discussed with regard to negative emissions, trying to reduce carbon in the atmosphere already. Could each of you give me one strategy that you would recommend, since that seems to be one of the areas that we aren't as aggressive on yet?
I'll just mention one, and I'm sure my colleagues will mention the others, is through improved forestry, planting of trees, and agricultural changes, we can enhance the sequestration of CO2 in forests and
So
soils.
forestry and, sorry, my time's limited. Forestry and more trees. I totally agree. Next.
I would say direct air capture is another pathway.
Direct air capture.
I think that covers it.
Okay. Dr. Cletus.
The natural solutions are ones that we should prioritize, recognizing that climate change itself is affecting our natural sink. We've seen a record heat wave in Alaska this year, for example. Every time we have wildfires, if permafrost starts to melt, that natural sink is getting eroded. So we need to keep that in mind.
Thank you. I also wanted to correct a misstatement that was made so far in the committee. There were turbine graphics that were put up that were based upon 2 megawatt wind turbines, and we now have 12 megawatt wind turbines offshore, so I think it's important to correct the record on that. I want to end by talking about some of the themes that we talked about yesterday in committee. First, we have to trust the science as best we can and help it lead us to the solutions. I think that's actually easier than the second part, which is building consensus. But it's absolutely critical that we build consensus. We're getting tugged from every which way politically around here, and we're not going to please every single person in the Congress, but we need a working majority of Democrats and Republicans who are going to come together to get a bill that will, a slate of bills that will get us to this 100% clean energy in 2050. And the only thing we can't afford to do is inaction. We have to act on climate, and so thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree with the panel and all our people here about the United States must do its part to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. But we've got to keep in mind this is a global issue and not one confined to the United States. An MIT report that I have a copy of here, MIT report came out that says it matters little to the global environment what the United States does to decarbonize its economy. If emissions in China and India continue to go unabated, coastal cities in the United States will still flood. Wildfires, droughts, and storms will continue. So it's not going to fall entirely on the United States. I also appreciate the potential for renewables, but they are currently limited. Even Secretary Moniz expressed his doubts in remarks he made earlier this year. He said as recently as February, he said 100% renewables by 2015 is not realistic and certainly not cost effective. And then followed with that, a study by Wood Mackenzie calculated that for us to go to 100% renewables, to have the cleanest energy possible, we would require 900 gigawatts of battery storage. 900 gigawatts of battery storage. Now, what do we have now? Totally around the globe, we only have 5.5 gigawatts of battery storage, but we need, just in America alone, 900. So meanwhile, the rest of the world still has this voracious appetite for coal because it's cheap and easy to make. IEA says that they're still going to mount, by 2040, they're still going to, 75% of the power is going to come from fossil fuels. So I think I go back to remarks that were made earlier. America has the capacity and the wherewithal to innovate, to lead in innovation. And that means putting significantly more money into carbon capture, significantly more money. And I would include, too, on that, Dr. Hauser, I think they need to look at how we're going to spend biologically in phytoplankton as part of that study. So I want to come back to you on that. So in so doing, if we can capture, if we can lead again on this, we can then export this technology to other nations and help them out. So if I could go to Ms. Angelski, I've given you some quotes from Secretary Moniz. Was he right?
With respect to the renewables, is that what you're referring
Yes,
to?
yes.
I don't want to comment on the capability of renewables technology, but I will say that I do I think there are issues that haven't been discussed with respect to going to 100% renewables, and you touched on them, which is the capability of storage technologies and the environmental sustainability as
Do
well.
you agree
associated
with
those.
MIT's assessment
Yes.
that the reliance of India and China is putting the globe at risk? It's not the United States, because we're already decreasing our CO2 emissions.
Correct.
So, would you agree?
So I would agree.
And do you agree? What about Wood Mackenzie's report about the? So you have a concern too, then, about the amount of battery storage, battery
right.
capabilities.
Well, one thing that we don't talk about is where we get the materials for those batteries and how we have to mine them and develop them, and the greenhouse gas profile or the environmental sustainability of those. So potentially a subject of another hearing, but certainly that in and of itself could present a geopolitical challenge as well.
There was a question, I think it was Mr. Carter perhaps asked it, or someone down on my left asked about whether we could retrofit. And so the question, I was hoping someone would speak up on this. So I'll ask the question a little slightly different way. How would the new source review reform, how would it impact retrofitting for carbon capture technology? What do we need some new source review reform?
So I'll refer really to the Petronova project, which really had to face that potential challenge when they were retrofitting their existing coal plant with this carbon capture system. They decided, in order to not open up their existing permit, which would then trigger new source review, they decided to build a separate power plant to power that facility. Not that model is not likely something that can be replicated by every coal-fired power plant or natural gas-fired power plant in this country. So potentially that could be a deterrent for retrofitting with carbon capture.
I've got just one quick question back to Dr. Hauser. Are we spending enough money biologically to try to do some engineering work in phytoplankton?
Are you referring to algae-based biofuels, sir?
Yeah, no, just in the oceans, the phytoplankton. That you understand its role, correct?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you're talking about the production of biofuels or if you're talking about...
No, I'm talking about phytoplankton in the oceans.
As a sequestration
It is the
option?
I'm sorry. 50% of the oxygen through the sync process, the photosynthesis process, comes through phytoplankton. As much as trees, shrubs, grass, and everything else. So I'm a little surprised. We need to be focusing more on what we're going to do in the oceans to be able to increase the phytoplankton content so that we can increase their CO2 capture.
Yes, I'm not an expert in that, so I don't know the potential for increasing ocean sequestration as you describe, but I'd be happy to get back to you if I can find some experts.
Please, if you could. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes a gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Deget, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This is a really important hearing, and I've been watching the testimony and the questioning of the witnesses. And we've all talked about the fact that climate science indicates we need to cut net global greenhouse gas emissions in half in 10 years and then reduce the net emissions to zero in 30 years, or we'll expose our children, grandchildren, and their children to great risk. I think all of us agree that the science is important and we need to do this, but it's not going to be easy. So I want to ask some questions to you about the science. First of all, for everybody, do you agree that many of the technologies that we're going to need for these emission cuts are either commercially available or approaching commercial availability? Mr. Hauser?
Yes, I think there's
Thanks.
a wide range of technologies, yes.
Okay. How about you, Ms. Cletus?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, and how about you, Mr. Cohen?
Yes.
And how about you, Ms. Angeleski?
Yes.
Okay, so all of you agree that we have those technologies available, and they're becoming more and more cost effective, I think. I wanted to ask about, but I wanted to ask you something that's kind of looming out there for people like me who are trying to work in a bipartisan way on climate legislation, and that's this. We've all been talking about this goal of zero by 2050. Could we do zero with technologically and economically within 10 years? And I'll start with you, Mr. Hauser.
think it would be extremely difficult and expensive to go to net zero in 10 years.
And would it have severe societal ramifications?
I think it would be very costly, and I think there would be pushback.
What about you, Ms. Angeleski? What's your view?
What I would say is that the capability exists to get to net zero, which I think was your first question.
In 10 years?
But the time frame is questionable, as I think Dr. Hausker said. I mean, what we really need to do is innovate more to help improve the technology and reduce costs. And so putting a time frame of 10 years on it might not be practical.
Okay, and what's your view, Mr. Cohen?
Technically possible, economically challenging.
And are you aware of any studies that would show the cost?
Of the accelerations,
Right.
moving the, no, I am not, but I can look and get back to you.
If you can, I would appreciate that. Dr. Cletus, what's your view on this?
10 years will be deeply challenging, but we have to get moving right away and get as far as we can in that 10 years because the science is really sobering.
I totally agree with you. And in fact, you know, in my state of Colorado, some of you probably know, we did this renewable energy standard, and the power companies totally opposed it. And so we had to do it by ballot initiative. And then we were able to achieve the goals in just a few years. And so we actually went back in and increased it legislatively with the support of all of the energy companies. So it's the kind of thing, if we get started now, we may be able to increase it. But what we're trying to think about is what kind of reasonable legislation can we pass to make that happen? And I'm wondering, when you all say it would be technologically feasible but very expensive, what kinds of things would we have to do to reach that in 10 years? Dr. Hausker?
Yeah, I think I can throw some light on that. A lot of it is related to capital stock turnover. And different important pieces of energy-using equipment have different lifetimes. A car may have a lifetime of 15 years. A water heater may have a life of 10 years. A building may have a life of 100 years, industrial plant. So the way to decarbonize effectively but not incur really huge costs is to try to use our existing capital stock, and when it turns over, that's when you go with the very efficient zero-carbon
I gotcha. I have no idea how much time I have left, so I have one more question, if I may, Madam Chair. I don't know how. Is my time up?
Your time has expired.
Okay, well, the question I have, which I'd like a written answer to everybody, is a lot of people talk about natural gas as a bridge fuel to get to zero carbon. The question I'd like you to give me an answer in writing is, that's only a bridge fuel if we deal with the methane, as near as I can understand. Because if you don't deal with the methane, then you're not going to be able to get carbon capture. And with that, I'll yield back, and I apologize, I don't know what's going on with
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
I thank the chair, and I thank the panelists for testifying this morning. The warming of the planet is accelerating, and I'm convinced that we're going to blow past the 2 degrees Celsius increase, exceeding the limits that the IPCC is calling for, no matter what we do in terms of carbon emission reductions. Consequently, we need to be looking at all the potential tools in our climate solution toolbox, including funding research for climate intervention and geoengineering. Given the complexity of the climate system and the risks that are associated with interfering in it, how do you think the U.S. government should field research on climate intervention, starting with Dr. Hauser and going down?
It merits some research. It's a very controversial area, however.
This is not something that I have studied, so I can't comment on this. I'll defer to my colleagues.
Research in 2 areas is required. One is the physical systems, and also we need to think really about governance. What would you do if you actually had these technologies to deploy?
Thank you.
Cutting emissions and investing in climate resilience have to be our first-line solutions here. But given where we are from a climate perspective, it is appropriate for us to have a better understanding of the risks and potential of things like geoengineering. However, we oppose any deployment of the technology at this point. There are too many risks associated with it, too many unknowns. We think there is a role for small-scale experiments, but only if accompanied by very strong governance regimes to make sure that all of the risks are being appropriately accounted for. At this point, the U.S. government has stepped so far away from its responsibilities in terms of resilience and cutting emissions that we do not think that under the current administration it would be a responsible move to deflect attention towards this type of a technology development right now.
Well, thank you. And I agree that we don't know enough about the science to decide one way or the other right now if geoengineering is appropriate. And we need to invest to make the science available so that we'll understand what the consequences and risks are. Mr. Clowen, direct emissions, which are from industry, make the industrial sector the third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's also one of the hardest to decarbonize. Currently, the greatest impediments to commercializing, deploying, and eventually, or what are the biggest impediments to moving to decarbonizing the industrial sector?
Well, it's, so let me start with the solutions. I mean, really, there are two main problems, or two main sources of CO2 from industry. There's the process heat on the front end, and that's provided by fossil fuels today, unabated fossil fuels. And then there's inherent CO2 coming out the back end from things like steel and cement production. So, as I said earlier, the two major solution pathways would be to substitute a high-temperature source of heat for the fossil fuels, and that could be from nuclear, from high-temperature nuclear. It could be from hydrogen manufactured from a number of sources. And then on the back end, carbon capture. The impediment right now to implementing those is actually not technical. We've got demonstrations of both of those technologies in place on large industrial facilities around the world. It's going to be driving the costs down and making them really a feasible, economically feasible solution for those big, heavy industries.
Well, I spent a career developing wind energy technology, and I see renewables being significant in the sense that you can overproduce energy in renewables, and then you have periods where there's no production. And the overproduction, you could create hydrogen by breaking water. There's things that we can do. I think the efficiency, the turnaround, the round-trip efficiency of breaking water and then burning hydrogen is not what we need it to be, but there's
That is one pathway. The only caution I would put on that is that you have maybe some of the same issues with intermittency on the grid that you would have electrolysis. That is, you build an electrolysis plant, if you're running it at very low capacity because you're relying only on variable sources of energy, you might have some issues. But in principle, yes, renewable energy can be a hydrogen source.
Mr. Ajaleski, is there an economic method to create carbon fiber from carbon dioxide?
I am not intimately familiar with carbon fiber production, but certainly there are research programs underway at DOE at looking at novel markets like carbon fibers, for example, and converting that CO2 into marketable products. So I'm aware of companies that are investing in the development of that, but at the scale that would be needed to really store CO2 in those fibers, I'm not, up on exactly where they are with that right now. But
thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Mrs. Dingell, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank Chairman Tonko for holding this hearing. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here because I do think we really are at a critical moment in our human history. The planet's warming, the ice is melting, the seas are rising. We're seeing the heat waves. I really felt it with 111 degrees and no air conditioning this weekend. Droughts, floods, and wildfires are ravaging our communities. And nobody can deny we're seeing the hurricanes. And the one thing we do have agreement on, all of our best and brightest scientists agree, the climate's changing with every amount of carbon that's being emitted across the economy. So I just want to say we've got to find the will and we've got to do it together. So means all the stakeholders, all the industry, and there are a lot of complicated issues. I'm a car girl, and I'll always be proud of being a car girl. And transportation industry is a part of this not only in the United States, but in it worldwide. And don't have enough time to even ask questions about what's happening here versus other countries who are really taking that on. But I think every great human achievement begins with the goal. And the goal for the moment, I think, is 100 by 50, meaning we set our course to achieve, it's a goal, to set 100% clean energy economy by 2050. I'm working on a bill with my colleague, Mr. Meacham, and others that will establish a 100% clean energy economy goal by 2050, and we hope to introduce the legislation soon. But I want to ask some questions, because everybody says it's ambitious, and then I do have young people that are in my district office and every place I'm going telling me we're not being ambitious enough soon enough. And it's, you know, we need to have the vision, a goal, and how do we get there as fast as we can. First, a question to all of you. A quick yes or no from the panel. Do you believe with American ingenuity and spirit we can find the collective will to get there? Dr. Husker?
Absolutely, yes.
Yes.
Yep.
We can and we must.
That's great. Okay. Dr. Cletus, I'm going to ask you some questions. Can you reiterate why it's so critical, as you just had your passion again, set a 100 by 50 goal today, and why it is so urgent?
It's urgent because of the climate impacts we're already feeling at 1 degree Celsius right now. As you pointed out, the terrible heat waves that we're seeing, the wildfires, the flooding, the intensified storms. This points out to us that we're already paying the costs of climate change. We've heard several Congress people today point out that making a clean energy transition will come with some investment costs, but those costs pale in comparison to runaway climate change. We need to address this problem because we owe it to our children and grandchildren. Those young people who are urging us to be ambitious, this is about the world we're leaving them.
Thank you. Mr. Cohen, I'm going to ask you these questions. I'm going to, because I do come from Michigan, I'm going to do electric vehicles. With the rollout of more and more electric vehicles, how would electrifying the transportation sector help us achieve a net zero carbon pollution by 2050?
Well, clearly, if we're decarbonizing the grid at the same time we're doing that, we're going to be reducing net carbon. That's obviously a great step forward.
How do we accelerate the rollout of electric vehicle and the need for the infrastructure? I've heard all of you, not all of you, but express concern about the battery capability. There's no consumer confidence in the electric vehicles, and we're not building the grid we need to do to build it. It's a chicken and egg. What do we need to do?
So, well, the first thing I think we need to do is think about increasing the penetration of both electric vehicle take-up and the charging infrastructure. But as I said earlier, I think we also need some other pathways, and so I think these zero-carbon fuels could provide, particularly for heavy freight, could provide a backstop or a complement. I think we have to be going in both ways at once. A technology-neutral, low-carbon fuel standard analogous to what people have proposed on the electricity side would probably provide a really good market signal.
Because I'm almost out of time, I'm going to ask Dr. Cletus this question because our fuel economy standards came up earlier. And how do they fit into the range of tools we've discussed today to decarbonize our economy? Would they help us get to 100 by 50? And I do think they need to, personally believe we need year-to-year increases. How do we do it in a real, part of the challenge for all of us is how we do all of this in the fastest way, but the real way.
So the interesting thing about it is doing it together is actually the cost-effective way to do it. We can clean up the economy better if we are simultaneously building out the infrastructure in the transportation sector to electrify as much as we can, even as we decarbonize the grid. We need to do this together. The fuel economy standards are critical. Right now, as we all said, the transportation sector is the biggest contributor to U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Emissions are rising in this sector. Those fuel economy standards are going to deliver a huge benefit in terms of emission reductions, as well as consumer benefits, public health, and lowering their bills for fuel.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. McEachin, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to start off by thanking both Chairman Pallone and Chairman Tonko for their leadership in this area and for having this hearing. I'm honored to serve with them as we work to preserve and protect our planet. There is no issue more important than preventing and mitigating climate change and speeding our transition to a clean energy economy. Their leadership is helping to ensure that we create a healthy, sustainable planet for future generations, and I'm humbled to be their partner in that work. The best science says we need to completely stop adding climate pollution to the atmosphere by 2050, if not sooner. That is why I am fighting for bold action now. That is why I'll be introducing legislation along with Congresswoman Highland, Congresswoman Dingell, Congressman Blumenauer, and Chairman Tonko to transition the United States to a 100% clean energy economy. 100% clean will protect public health and our environment, create well-paying, clean jobs, and strengthen our economy. It'll mitigate the impacts of climate change for all communities and all generations, especially those disproportionately impacted by its worst effects. As we engage in this important policy work, we must break the decades-long cycle of environmental injustice. For much of our history, unjust policies have caused many of our most vulnerable friends and neighbors to lead sicker, shorter, and more difficult lives. So we desperately need climate action, we desperately need climate justice, and we cannot have one without the other. Dr. Cleed, did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. A just cause and a fighting spirit do not guarantee success, and we have only one chance with climate change. We have to hit our marks. When it comes to reducing emissions, can you speak to what kind of processes, as distinct from technologies or policy choices, are most apt to move the needle? End goals are crucially important, but is there value in interim goals and in regularly scheduled checkups and progress reports?
Thank you, Congressman McEachin, and I just want to thank you and Congressman Grijalva for the way in which you have centered environmental justice in addressing this problem of climate change. In terms of the processes, I would say two things. Absolutely, we do need interim goals. This is not just about 2050. This is about where we get in the next decade as well. Because in that time, we have the opportunity to get very far in cutting emissions, and we have the opportunity also to make sure that we're protecting people from the climate impacts already underway. We need to engage directly with stakeholders and communities that have often been left on the sidelines of this challenge. Environmental justice communities have solutions to this problem, and they must have a seat at the table as we go about solving this problem. Just last week, there was a national platform released by environmental justice groups and national environmental groups, an equitable and just national climate platform, which has many elements in it of what that process could look like and the vision for an equitable, centered climate platform.
Thank you. Doctor, once we make a formal commitment to act, how do we make real-time adjustments and keep ourselves on a path to success?
The opportunity we have here is if we get going in an ambitious way, the costs of technologies are falling all the time. Folks on the panel have pointed out wind, solar, we've seen double-digit cost declines year on year. We've seen battery storage costs come down. Just in the last decade, over a 70% reduction in wind and solar costs. So if we get started in an ambitious way, the opportunity we'll have is that when we get 5 years out or 10 years out, we know we can ratchet up ambition because the cost of these technologies will have fallen.
Thank you. You have said that done right, an economy-wide low-carbon energy transition can also help address long-standing inequities for low-income communities and communities of color. I need you to expound upon that. Is there a danger that we end up with climate action in the absence of climate justice, or vice versa? And if so, how can we best avoid those dangers?
Solving climate change in an equitable way won't happen by accident. We have to have that intentionality from the beginning to center equity. We know that as we cut CO2 emissions, we have the opportunity to cut other co-pollutants that are causing near-term public health burdens in these communities, from mercury, from particulate matter, from sulfur dioxide emissions, NOx emissions. So the opportunity we have is making sure that we're making emission cuts and prioritizing emission cuts in communities that are overburdened by these other kinds of co-pollutants, even as we cut carbon dioxide pollutants. The other opportunity we have is to make sure that the benefits of clean energy are accruing directly to these communities, that they have access to these modern clean technologies, the efficient technologies that can save people money, as well as make sure that they too will clean up the air and water in their communities.
Thank you. I thank the witnesses, and I thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I request unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record: a letter from the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers and the Nuclear Energy Institute, 3 fact sheets from the Nuclear Energy Institute, and a report from the Blue-Green Alliance on its platform for climate action. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I would like to thank all of our witnesses for joining us here today, at today's hearing. I remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by our witnesses. I ask each witness to respond promptly to any such questions that you may receive. At this time, the subcommittee is adjourned.